The Redemptionist Crusade, also known more informally as the Cult of the Redemption, is an offshoot of the Imperial cult which originated upon the Hive world of Necromunda. Even by the standards of other religious movements throughout the Imperium, the Redemptionist cult is one that is notorious for both its zeal and fanaticism, as its members will eagerly, if not gleefully, purge anyone that they deem to be sinners with both fire and blade. Indeed, the cult's members believe that in order for humanity to be redeemed in the eyes of the God Emperor and in turn regain his favor, every man, woman, and child must atone for their sins or be punished, regardless as to how minor such transgressions may seemingly be. Not only can one be deemed as a sinner for the obvious crimes of being a mutant, blasphemer, or psyker, but even minor vices such as drinking, swearing, lechery, or lying will draw the ire and wrath of the Redemptionists. So influential is the cult of redemption that it has even been adopted as the official religion of House Cawdor, one of Necromunda's major clan houses, the head of which also serving as the head of the Redemptionist cult, although some would argue that House Cawdor itself has now become little more than a front for the organization as a whole. However, due to the numerous atrocities committed by the cult's followers, such as burning entire settlements to ash and slaughtering supply convoys with little to no provocation, the various merchant guilds of Necromunda have declared Redemptionist Crusade gangs to be little more than outlaws and vagabonds, an act that, in the eyes of the cult, only further proves just how corrupt and full of sin humanity truly is. In spite of this, the cult of redemption continues to gain support and influence throughout the Underhive, especially during times of calamity and turmoil. In early M42, Necromunda would undergo a period of intense political upheaval as Lord Geronitus Helmar, the world's planetary governor, would fall victim to an attempted assassination. While Lord Helmar survived the attack, the wounds he sustained from the assassin's poisoned blades would leave him perilously close to death, forcing him to be interred within a stasis casket until his wounds could be properly treated. However, due to Lord Helmar having no named successor, his 13th daughter, Lady Hera Helmar, would use this opportunity to make her bid for power, killing 6 of her siblings in order to ensure that she would not only become the next head of House Helmar, but the de facto ruler of all Necromunda. And yet, while all of this was happening, Lady Credo, the head of the disgraced noble house of the same name, had instigated an uprising throughout Necromunda's capital of Hive Primus in an attempt to oust House Helmar from power and return House Credo to glory. The most decisive blow that Credo struck against House Helmar, at least early on, was the taking of a settlement named Cinderak City, where Credo's forces, along with her allies in House Escher and House Orlok, clashed against members of House Goliath that were loyal to the Helmar dynasty. While the resulting battles reduced Cinderak City to little more than a ruinous mound of rubble, Credo's forces would ultimately succeed in driving the Goliaths, as well as the majority of the civilian population, out of the city and into the wastes, leaving the settlement firmly under rebel control. But shortly after the fall of Cinderak, a figure carrying a banner adorned with the skeletal remains of a long-forgotten saint would emerge from the burning ruins of the city, barring the path of men, women, and children that had fled the carnage that destroyed their homes. This figure, a Redemptor priest known simply as the Prophet, would then approach the assembled civilians and gangers with the bones of the saint upon his banner beginning to glow with what could only be described as a holy light. A wave of religious euphoria would then wash over the crowd, causing many of them to kneel before the prophet and the saintly carcass that he bore. While the prophet never uttered a single word during this exchange, the refugees of Cinderak nonetheless accepted him as their savior, as if the God Emperor himself had appeared before them. The prophet would then lead his new followers on a great pilgrimage to Hive Temenos, the religious capital of Necromunda, in order to locate the tomb to the Father of all Saints. Thereafter, whenever the prophet delivered a sermon to his congregation, he would speak with the voice of the lost saint whose bones adorned his banner, which would rattle and vibrate as if the saint itself were addressing the masses. Not only this, but the corona of light and faith that seemed to halo the prophet would at times grow so intense that it could be seen even from the highest spires of Hive Primus itself. While some of his fellow redemptionists, such as the followers of Clovis or members of the splinter group known as the Red Redemption, would claim the prophet to be nothing more than a heretical fraud or even a Xenos witch, his following and influence would only continue to grow as more and more people flocked to hear the words of the lost saint spoken through his chosen vessel every day. So influential would the prophet become that Lady Helmar, in an attempt to curb his ever-increasing popularity, would outlaw all splinter faiths and offshoots of the redemptionist cult, save for those personally sanctioned by Lord Mormare, the ruling Thane of House Cawdor, before making preparations to deal with the prophet herself. This, however, would only serve to fracture the already divided redemptionists even further, with hundreds if not thousands of the cult's members choosing to instead throw their support behind the prophet and the lost saint who spoke through him. Little did anyone realize, however, that the turmoil and havoc left in the wake of the prophet's pilgrimage was all part of a plan that had been carefully orchestrated by both Lady Credo and her unseen master in order to further destabilize the Helmar regime. Regardless, seeing as how the skeletal remains of the so-called lost saint adorning the prophet's banner are not only supposedly able to speak with him, but have been shown to, on occasion, emit a blinding holy light, then just who or what could this saint have truly been? According to the book The Aranthian Succession Vaults of Temenos, the bones adorning the banner of the prophet are stated outright to be the ancient remains of a Redemptor priest. With this in mind, it seems fairly reasonable to assume that the lost saint is none other than one of the most infamous and feared individuals that the cult of redemption has ever known, a man known simply as the Arch-Zealot. In life, the Arch-Zealot was a nomadic, hermit-like figure who was regarded as both a mystic and a prophet to other members of the Redemption. The Arch-Zealot was also known to hold views that were considered extreme, even to other redemptionists, resulting in many calling for him to be excommunicated from the cult altogether. The Arch-Zealot was known to have been an incredibly charismatic and skilled orator, able to rouse entire settlements into a violent state of religious frenzy with just a few carefully chosen words. From an initial glance, it would certainly appear that the bones adorning the banner of the prophet could very well have belonged to the Arch-Zealot. After all, not only do both the Arch-Zealot and Lost Saint sport long beards and bronze half-face masks, but they are also adorned with flamboyant headgear which, in both cases, doubles as a brazier. The Lost Saint being the Arch-Zealot could also potentially explain how the saint's bones were able to radiate with holy light. After all, given his title of Arch-Zealot, it's reasonable to assume that the Zealot's faith in the imperial cult, and by extension his worship of the God Emperor, would have been close to an all-consuming devotion. This, in turn, could have resulted in the Arch-Zealot displaying a number of, for want of a better term, pseudo-psychic traits, as it has been shown that the power of faith is capable of manifesting a number of otherworldly abilities, which are often accompanied with a holy light. However, while there is indeed plenty of evidence to suggest the Lost Saint is indeed the Arch-Zealot of the Redemption, there are a number of problems with this particular hypothesis. Firstly, while the remains of the Lost Saint are adorned with a mask similar to that of the Arch-Zealot, it's important to note that all redemptionists, excluding the prophet for unknown reasons, wear masks, The reasoning for this, according to the book Gangs of the Underhive, is as a way for followers of the redemptionist faith to show their meekness and humility, lest the God Emperor find them guilty of the sin of pride for displaying their individuality. Secondly, the brazier-like headgear that sits atop the skull of the lost saint appears to be subtly different from the one that was worn by the archzealot. While wearing a brazier on one's head would certainly appear to be a fairly unique and distinctive act, it's important to note that the archzealot was not the only Redemptor priest to do so, as other high-ranking or otherwise notable members of the cult, such as Clovis the Redeemer, are also known to wear brazier-like headgear as a sign of their devotion and faith. And thirdly, the remains of the lost saint carried by the prophet are said to be, in no uncertain terms, ancient. While the archzealot has seemingly vanished following the creation of the colossal warp space rift known as the Cicatrix Maledictum, he was implied to have still been active as recently as 999.M41. Since the remains of the lost saint are said to be ancient, this would appear to imply that the bones are centuries, if not millennia, old. According to the book House of Faith, the earliest known accounts of the redemptionist cult date back to late M39. With this in mind, it's possible that the lost saint himself was, in fact, one of the earliest known Redemptor priests. This then leads to the next possibility regarding the identity of the lost saint, in that the skeletal remains carried by the prophet belong to Encordarius Brain, the very founder of the Cult of the Redemption. According to the official records of House Cawdor, Encordarius Brain was once a simple yet pious manufactorum worker who despaired at the plight of his fellow workers, whose suffering was due to the greed of the world's noble houses. It was supposedly after suffering an accident in which he fell into the inner workings of some great industrial machine that Brain would be saved by a blinding flash of light. This light, according to Brain, was a sign that the God Emperor had chosen him to embark on a quest of redemption in order to save Necromunda's populace from both corruption and damnation. However, while both House Cawdor and the Cult of Redemption claim this to be the official story behind the cult's founding, numerous other stories regarding Encordarius Brain are known to exist, which paint him as either a violent thug that simply found religion, or as a con man who founded the cult purely as a way to fund his various addictions. Needless to say that House Cawdor and the Redemptionist react less than favorably to such claims, with those daring to speak ill of Encordarius Brain rarely surviving to recount such stories more than once. In either case, Brain would ultimately be canonized by the Cult of the Redemption as a saint. Seeing as the bones carried by the prophet are stated to be the ancient remains of a Redemptor priest, it's possible that the lost saint is none other than Encordarius Brain himself. After all, as the man who founded the Cult of Redemption to begin with, Brain could arguably be seen as the very first Redemptor priest, and seeing as how the cult began its rise to power over 2,000 years ago, his remains would indeed be regarded as ancient. As well as this, if the accounts claimed by House Cawdor are true, and that Brain was indeed saved after being enveloped by a holy light, then this would certainly provide an explanation as to how the bones of the lost saint were also able to radiate with the same divine power. While Brain would certainly appear to be a strong candidate in regards to the identity of the lost saint, the term lost saint would appear to imply that the individual in question is a man whose identity has been, for want of a better term, lost to time. As such, seeing as Encordarius Brain's name is well known and venerated throughout the Redemptionist cult, it would make little sense as to why he would be referred to as a lost saint, unless the term lost in this particular instance is referring to the fact that some of Brain's physical remains have been physically lost, though this does seem somewhat unlikely. Alternatively, perhaps the lost saint is simply a Redemptor priest whose name, as implied by his title, has simply faded from memory, with the only records of his deeds being those spread through whispers and hearsay. Or perhaps the lost saint is not truly a saint at all, and that instead the banner carried by the prophet is little more than an elaborate prop. After all, some redemptionists believe the prophet to be little more than a heretic and witch, one that has clad itself in the guise of a priest in order to lead the emperor's subjects astray. Indeed, the prophet, as mentioned earlier, is noted to be one of, if not the only known member of the redemptionist cult not to hide his face behind a mask, a fact that could very well prove him guilty of sin in the eyes of the cult's more orthodox members. If this were the case, then perhaps the light known to emanate from the bones of the lost saint was not holy in nature, but rather a trick or an illusion caused through either technological or possibly even psychic means. Whatever the truth may be, few can deny that the presence of the lost saint was in itself a major factor behind the rise of the prophet, even if the identity of the saint himself remains unconfirmed. What do you think? Leave a comment below with your ideas, and thank you for watching.